Hi guys, thank you for tuning in to watch our first Dissemination Day presentation. As you know, because we told you, we're going to be looking at this paper here. I really like this paper because it's, in my opinion, very helpful, but it's also super short. It literally comprises of 4 pages. They present the information really well, so it's very readable. And if you're having a think at the moment about how to implement PBS approaches in your own services, then I think you'll find it really useful. So let's get started. We've printed the article details here for you in case anyone hasn't been able to see it on the photo or they can't find it. So the article is called The Impact of a Whole Organisation Approach to Positive Behavioural Support on the Use of Physical Interventions. It's by Alan K. Horwood Gray and Mines, and it was published in 2012 in Build's International Journal of Positive Behaviour Support. The purpose of this research was to build on a previous publication of David Allen's, which you can see in the slide there. It was published by Build and is called Reducing the Use of Restrictive Practices with People Who Have Intellectual Disabilities. In this little book, Allen suggests, he looks at the different factors that are likely to reduce the use of restrictive practices for this population, and he suggests that positive behaviour support is going to be effective for this. I know that a lot of people have found these sort of mini publications from Build to be really helpful, so I wanted to point out that there's a really recent one from last year called Person-Centered Restraint Reduction Planning and Action, and that's by Roy DeVoe and Sarah Leach, and if you're interested you can see it at that URL there. The authors of this paper that we're talking about here had conducted a review of previous research where people were trying to determine what factors were important for restriction reduction. And whilst they weren't specifically talking about PBS, that previous research wasn't specifically talking about PBS, what they found was that there were a lot of common factors between what was determined to be important and what PBS provides, including significant management commitment and support, active service user consultation, physical, social and programmatic environments, which are really important, clear reactive behavioural support plans, a clear mediator analysis, a data-driven approach, and assessing implementation and fidelity of service outcomes. Additionally, they had identified that staff well-being was a really important factor, and that workforce management, where you deploy your resources across the service, was going to be really important. The point that really struck a chord with me there, just as I was saying it, was creating physical, social and programmatic environments, and creating acceptable environments. And it made me think of some training we did quite recently with Greg Hanley, where he made the point that if you are not happy for what you are doing to be aired on the evening news, then you should really be asking yourself why you're doing it. And I think it really resonated then, but never more so than following the recent Panorama program that absolutely everyone must have watched by now, and if you haven't then you should. We've had discussions with service providers where they've told us that they're considering making it a mandatory part of their induction program because it's so important, in just about everybody's opinion, that we remember how culture has an impact on the way that people behave and how these situations still happen. So on to the good bit now. What did they actually do? This particular piece of research was a really longitudinal approach, so they conducted it over a period of 7 years, which is really quite impressive. And what they described as being their primary goal was the primary organisational goal is the establishment of service-wide competence in PBS. So this is for the whole service, and the service was quite large. As far as I understand it, there were 43 supported people, or the capacity for 43 supported people in both acute admission wards and long stay units. So as an organisation, to have your primary goal be the establishment of service-wide competence in PBS, that's really a hell of a commitment. The individuals there were adults with intellectual disabilities and or complex and challenging behaviour and or mental health needs. So that clearly is quite a broad range potentially. And they highlighted that the majority of individuals had transferred from institutional settings. They identified that 50% of their staff had a nursing background, so that's quite a strong nursing presence, much more so than many social care provisions. And 50% of the staff were non-registered health professionals, which refers to really support staff or frontline care staff. All staff were trained in vocational qualifications in PBS, and this was actually part of their job descriptions, so it was a really non-negotiable. And whilst it doesn't specifically say what those vocational qualifications were in the paper, I did go and do a bit of digging about that because it referred to a previous paper, and I believe that will be the ABMU BTEC, which you can do level 3, 4, or 5. Of that, and I guess that they picked the level dependent on the skills and the requirement of the individual staff members involved. Additionally, they highlighted that all supported individuals within the setting had an individualised PBS plan. Quick amendment there, not 43 supported people, the capacity for up to 64 supported people, 24 of which would be on the acute admission facility that they have, and they also had capacity for 40 people in a long stay environment. The authors also made the point of highlighting a few additional factors that may have contributed to the results, including the fact that all of their buildings were new buildings, and that provided a more optimal physical environment. They highlighted the fact that they used active support as an approach within their services. They had what they referred to as a management development program to reinforce the objectives. And actually, I would have really liked a bit more information about what that included, but they haven't defined that any further. And given the word count, that's fair enough. They also went on to use a periodic service review. And for anyone who's not clear on what a periodic service review is, we've put it here. It's a quality management tool that is grounded in the principles of OBM, which is Organizational Behavior Management, and you can see the book title here. And there is, I think the original reference, the one that the authors here use, is Lavinia 2004. Beyond that, they identify that they implemented an ACT program to support staff well-being and staff stress. So ACT is acceptance and commitment therapy. Again, it's a behaviour-based approach, and there is some basis for using that to support staff well-being in social care settings, and I've highlighted the reference that they use also here. So I've tried to pull out the factors here that they have used or mentioned to try and define what they mean by a whole organisational approach to positive behaviour support, and the significant individual factors that they've mentioned here include their staff training program, which is vast and is related, I think, to the ABMU BTEC, their staff wellbeing focus, which they meet through the use of ACT and a peer support program. They highlight, again, not just senior management commitment, but significant senior management commitment. They have implemented quality assurance procedures in the form of a PSR, and they've ensured that everyone has individualised BSPs. So hopefully that's a reasonable summary of their intervention or their independent variable. Their dependent variable in comparison was super simple. It was literally just the use of physical interventions, which they measured as part of the routine information that was kept by the services. I couldn't think of any better way to display this information than to just screenshot their own graphs and paste them here. So I hope that's okay, but I think they've done a really good job of presenting it. They categorised the physical interventions into 4 groups. The top one, the black diamond there, is total number of physical interventions. The one underneath the grey square, they categorise as the rate of use of self-defensive breakaway techniques. The black triangle is the rate of use of temporary holds for removing a person from one location where they are causing risks to themselves or others to a safer location. And the bottom black square there, they categorise as more restrictive seated or rarely supine restraints. So those would be the ones that we typically associate as being the most dangerous to the persons involved. This first graph here is the total mean use of physical interventions per bed space. The data is displayed over a 7-year period, and you can see that quite clearly marked. And it's really, really obvious to look at that there is just a huge reduction in the number of physical interventions used over those 7 years, with a massive reduction, particularly in breakaway techniques, but a really low rates of the use of the more dangerous restraints, included seated and supine. Figure 2 and Figure 3 are where they break those total figures down into the use of physical interventions, both in the long stay area and in the acute admissions area. And actually that breakdown becomes really helpful later during the discussion. You can see that in the long stay services there was an excellent decline. And actually in the acute admissions area, there was a much more fluctuating trend, although I don't know if you can quite make it out. There is an overall trend line on that graph, which is definitely going in a downwards direction. I think, and they talk about this in their paper, but you would expect a much more variable rates in acute admissions because you would expect that turnaround to be much faster and for people to be going into acute admissions because they're really maybe in crisis or nearing in crisis, and then to move on as soon as they're feeling better. Either way, no arguments that these are really positive outcomes. So these discussion points here are those which were identified by the authors themselves. And the first of which is the reliability of the data collection. So they highlighted the fact that they didn't ever do a check to see if the data that the services were giving them was in fact correct. So what they were saying was it is possible that recording got worse and that actually the physical interventions, the frequency of them had never changed, but people just got worse at recording it. They do say that they reckon that's unlikely because anecdotally the feeling from the services was very much that there had been a massive improvement. And if you look at the fluctuation back on figure 3, that would kind of argue against there being an overall decline over the 7-year period. The second point that they highlight as being a discussion point or potential limitation really is maturational effects. And what that means is that people just get better over time. So the behaviour improves because time passes and the person is coping better, or they're maybe more used to their environment, and therefore there are fewer opportunities for problem behaviour to occur. And that would sort of make sense, I guess, that when they said that a number of the individuals that they supported had come from institutional settings. So you might expect that there would be a higher level of complex behaviour or potentially challenging behaviour at the initial period, and then that would reduce as the people become more used to their environment, get to know their staff better, and that they have a more sort of systemized routine or what on. Again, that seems to be combated by the fluctuating figures in figure 3 to some degree, and again they highlighted that the anecdotal evidence, that was basically staff reporting, was that just wasn't their feeling as to what had happened, but it is possible. The third discussion point that they put forward was that they did only track physical intervention, and what that means is that it's possible, of course it's possible, that the reason that physical interventions reduced was that we were using other forms of restrictive practice. For example, as required medication or PRN, depending on what you call it, or seclusion. They highlighted that seclusion was specifically prescribed in their services, proscribed, which means that it's not allowed. But they also accepted that in a lot of places seclusion is not allowed and is happening anyway under the guise of some other kind of name. Again, they didn't feel that this was the case because the reporting from staff indicated that it was not happening, but they recognise the possibility. And the final discussion point that they highlight is that they didn't use an experimental design, which means they didn't have a control group. They didn't use maybe like an AB design where they would implement PBS to begin with and then withdraw it, and then implement it and then withdraw it to really kind of get a sensitive understanding of those effects. But they do make the point, and they're absolutely right, that that would have been an incredibly difficult thing to do, because once you have trained an entire staff team of this size in PBS, how on earth do you withdraw that? And even if you could, why would you? There would need to be some really clear ethical considerations there as to why that would be appropriate, but again, it's not possible under the circumstances anyway. So these final thoughts are thoughts of our own that we considered when we were reading this paper, which overall you may have guessed we found to be, very positive and encouraging. The first of which was this concept of a systemic PBS approach. And because they did all of these things, if you look back to the slide where I highlighted those 5 things they'd specifically identified as being part of their systemic PBS approach, we can't tell if maybe like 1 of those was enough, or maybe 2 of those was enough, or maybe you absolutely need all 5. And that would be really helpful to know. Our feeling across the PBS community and other research supports this is that you've got to have all these different parts, otherwise it doesn't work. We brought up the question of staff retention, and I would have really liked to know what the impact of this program was on staff retention. And the reason that we highlighted that was because so often when we're speaking with services and we're speaking with, whether it be hospitals or social care providers or schools or whoever, and we're talking about this investment in training, and particularly kind of accredited qualifications like the ABMU PBS BTEC, there is a fear from the service providers. What if I train all of my staff and they leave? And I don't know who responded with this originally, but I am super aware of Paddy always preaching this. What if you don't train them and they stay? Then you end up with an entirely untrained staff team who don't feel invested in and don't feel valued. So clearly, this is going to be an issue. But there was the issue of heavy investment in training, and they've been talking about the fact that they trained all of their staff. It was part of the job description. Everybody just had to do it. And whilst I think that's great and what a commitment, a lot of the smaller care providers, that is a big investment and they may not be able to manage that, particularly when you consider the supervision requirements that are going to go into that. And I think the final point that really resonated with me heavily and with us heavily is this concept of crucial management support. We have worked with so many services who are desperately doing their best, but if you do not have buy-in from both the top and the bottom, then it's just like swimming against the tide a lot of the time. And the services that we work with, I can think of two in particular, where the senior management team have really just invested in this process, not just financially, but in terms of commitment and time and effort and presence, that those are the services that are actually able to take it and fly. Those are the services who are really able to make it not just an add-on to what they do, but integral to what they do. And that is where PBS is going to have incredible outcomes like the ones that you're seeing here. So although this is, I guess this paper is about 7 years old, so the research will be just a little bit older than that. And they clearly had resources put into this research that were massively significant. I think that there are some interesting points that they take out here that are certainly relevant across the board to all social care providers and to all hospitals. And given the horrendous outcomes that were, there's horrendous realities that were unveiled at Walton Hall just a couple of weeks ago, and we could just, there have been previous panoramas that have been almost, just as horrifying. We know that we are going to have to double our efforts or continue our efforts on ensuring these individuals have, the best possible quality of life and are not being restricted in unnecessary ways. And clearly, there is one research paper does not an evidence-based make, but this is some really good support that positive behaviour support is going to be your tool to do that. So if you managed to hang on in there for the whole video, then thank you so much. It won't always be me. Some of the other team members will be jumping on here to show their faces, and hopefully you just find it helpful.